Well, welcome back.
Oh.
We counted everybody. There are 10 of you. I'm so glad to have you back on the bus. This tour before us is going to be a little difficult. It's not going to be nearly as glorious, you could say, as our first one. Remember, we went through tour 1 and we looked at creation. This was a glorious tour. And we had the privilege to turn and gaze upon the face of God and to see the most profound thing, that God is the God of life, but He creates His creatures, He equips them, He empowers them, and sends them. God works through His creatures. We see that right from the beginning. God desires to work through His creatures to bring forth fruit, and that fruit brings glory to Him. It was a glorious tour. And now we're going to turn our attention to the next epic in the meta-narrative of God. And this is not a pretty one. You know the details. We're not going to go through the details in this. But you know this is where everything changed. Everything now tipped from the river of life to the river of death. And all of that beauty and glory and the movement of everything in the creation and the created order now has been radically changed. And even a non-believer recognizes this. Even those who do not know God, even those who do not know Christ, they look around the world and they know that there's something that is not right. They know now that we find ourselves in a world that is not what it should be. Everything seems to move in this direction, not from life, but to death. And it's not a pretty picture, not at all. The world that we now live in is radically changed from the way that God had originally made it. It is a world that we all recognize as filled with death and destruction. It's not a pretty picture. We see still the glory of the creation. We still see beautiful things. But oftentimes, if we will just look, remember we were talking about not hearing and not seeing. We draw near to God and all of a sudden we do begin to hear the groaning and the moaning. Paul, moved by the Spirit of God, speaks of this. He talks about the creation that was subjected then to frustration. Have you ever thought about that? That the creation itself is frustrated in this fallen state, and that it is in bondage to decay. We all know that, do we not? Everything moves towards decay, and that the whole creation has been groaning. The creation groans under this fallen state, but it's not just the creation. We ourselves groan inwardly as the result of this. And so something happened now in the universe of life. Everything tipped from the river of life to the river of death. In the beginning, it was as if everything pulled. It's almost as if there was a gravity that pulled everything towards life and fruitfulness. We don't know what a world would be like, do we? Where everything always pulled towards more fruit and more life, where there was no death, That's foreign to us. Why? Because now everything pulls, gravity pulls us towards death and decay. If you're sick, you don't sit next, if Melissa's healthy and I'm sick, I don't say, oh, if I can just sit next to Melissa, I'll catch some health. It doesn't work that way, right? If Melissa's healthy, she doesn't want to sit next to me if I'm sick, because that's the way it goes. It pulls that way, and we can't stop it. We can't stop growing old. We can't stop things from decaying. Relationships, you know, that old thing. You know, the guy's, well, told my wife I loved her when we got married, and if anything changes, I'll let her know. It doesn't work that way, right? It doesn't work. Maybe, I don't know. We don't know what it was like over here, but now relationships require work, do they not? All of this requires work if we want to see fruit. And so now we live in a world in which it's more natural for us to float. It's more natural for us to do nothing. It's more natural to focus on me rather than the cultivating of others. This is where we find ourselves in neo-Christianity beginning to think that abiding is the end game, you know, rather than bearing fruit. Some of you may recall when our culture went through that radical change where it was a social faux pas to ask someone, well, what do you do? I don't know if you remember this. What do you do? It's not what I do, it's who I am. Do you remember that? Mm-hmm. It's who now, I'm not demeaning the notion of identity and who I am, but there was a radical shift there, was there not? This is the way the world flows. This just seems strange to me. Remember, Jesus said, he who is not with me is against me. And I thought, well, how is that possible? If I just remain neutral, how can Jesus say that I'm against him? Because in this world, if you float in this world, where will you end up? If you decide just to be a pretty green fig tree, there will be no life that comes from you. And so this is a world where Jesus tells a parable that if we don't recognize it because we're so used to it, he tells the parable. Remember, all the seeds don't flourish in the parable. The sower sows, and some fall on rocky soil. The thistles choke out others, the weeds and so forth. That's a parable of a description of the fallen world that we live in. If you told the parable and we were over here again, then all the seeds would fall on the rocks and they would flourish. The thistles, you'd have trouble getting thistles to grow in that world. So what happened? Well, you know the details. And again, remember, we're after an understanding of who God is. We're trying to seek his face through all of this. And so this is not an academic exercise, but you know that into that flourishing creation, now the villain arrives. And he arrives with a counter narrative. And Satan always does this. Satan is always in the business of turning things upside down and backwards. And so this narrative that we've been looking at, this glorious narrative where we find that throughout the larger story of God, God is desiring for his creatures to be fruitful, and that fruit brings glory to God. And from the get-go, he was going to work through his creatures. And now Satan arrives with a counter-narrative to destroy all of that. Do you remember we talked about him? In the Truth Project, we talked about him. And Jesus described him. And we focused on Jesus saying that he is a liar and the father of lies. And that is what led us to talk about this cosmic battle, the battle between truth and lie. And that is the cosmic battle. But we skipped over the opening description that Jesus gave of Satan. And that he is a murderer from the beginning. And maybe I skipped over that because at the time I wasn't sure I understood it, because I don't remember any place where Satan actually murdered anyone. But when we finish the tour, you'll know exactly why Jesus said he was a murderer from the beginning. And so if we think about it, the real war here, yes, it's a battle between truth and lie, but the real war is between life and death. And I would submit to you, all of the hot burning issues we find in our culture, ultimately, if you think about them, they go back to a battle between life and death. It's a battle between truth and lie, but it's also a battle between life and death. So Jesus speaks of Satan and says that he is a thief, and he comes only to steal and kill and destroy. Every one of those words is a word that stands contrary to life. These are words of death, are they not? But Jesus then said, but I have come that you might have life and have it abundantly. Okay, now I know you all enough to know that you have probably experienced this. I call it the neon light experience. You're reading through the scriptures, you've read the passage 100 times before, and then all of a sudden, it's like a neon light goes on, right? And it's like, who put this verse in there, right? Where did this come from? It's always been there. I think this is the work of the Holy Spirit. You know, Jesus called the Holy Spirit the Spirit of truth, who would guide us into all truth. And every once in a while, you're reading the scripture and the Spirit of God comes and he flips on a switch. Why? Because he wants you to look at this passage. This happened to me. I was reading in 2 Corinthians chapter 2. It's one of my favorite passages. I've read it 1,000 times. And then all of a sudden, Paul makes this little, it's like a theatrical aside. And Paul does this. You know, Paul has these very long sentences sometimes. And Paul, in the middle of making this point, he makes this aside. It's kind of like on stage, you know, where the actor goes like this. And Paul does this because all of a sudden he says, in order that Satan might not outwit us, for we are not unaware of his schemes. And then he goes on. And I went on, and then all of a sudden, boop, the Spirit of God flips the light on this passage. And I went back and I started to look at it. And I began to ask myself the question, I said, well, in order that Satan might not outwit us, for we are not unaware of his schemes. And I said, what are his schemes? And as soon as I said that, I realized I was unaware of his schemes. And so I wanted to change that. And for those of you who do know me, when I come into these situations where I'm confronted with a question like that, or an issue or a problem, I used to do in the old days, I'd get a new Bible, I'd start in Genesis 1, I'd have a highlighter, I'd go through the entire Bible, I'd highlight everything that had to do with that issue, and then I'd pull them out, like put them on stickies, and I'd say, okay, these go together, and these go together, and this doesn't go anywhere. And then I wanted to sit back and say, okay, this is what God says about this issue. And so I did that. And I highlighted everything that had to do with Satan, the serpent, the evil one, the devil, demons. And I announced to our small group that we were going to study the schemes of the devil. And we did that for a year. And my small group called it the dark year. Now, I'm not here to tell you that I know everything about the schemes of Satan, but I will begin by telling you this. Satan's end game is death. His end game is death, but we might say, well, is that dead? Because Satan, what he's after is a dead life, a fruitless life. What he wants, he's fine if you are a pretty green fig tree because you were dead. And so think about what Jesus said, or what God said. Jesus was the creator. In the very beginning, we saw this over and over again, the God of life, and his charge to his creatures to be fruitful, multiply, and fill the earth. And if you think about plants and animals and so forth, there's this marvelous thing called a seed that God has endowed us with, and that seed then produces more life. What I call this is the downstream life. We live in the Black Forest, and so these pine cones represent the seeds that come from a tree when the tree is fruitful. But that seed produces another life, and those lives produce more life, and those in turn more life and more life. This is the downstream life that is part of the vision of God in the beginning, to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth, and why God didn't create all of these plants. It was in the nature of God and the character of God that he was going to create his creatures, he was going to equip them, empower them, and he was then going to work through them that the creatures themselves would bring forth life, multiple life, downstream life. But Satan is after what we will call downstream death, because if he can get you, if he can get one of these creatures to stop producing, it's not just that creature that Satan has been effective with. All of that life that was intended to come from that creature has now been stamped out. And this is what Satan wants. There's a great passage, although it's a tough passage for us in Jude, where he says, "Woe to them, hidden reefs in your love feasts, caring for themselves." This is this self-centered attitude. "Clouds without water." How is a cloud fruitful? Brings forth rain. Clouds without water. Autumn trees without fruit. Doubly dead. Uprooted. And we're back again to this constant theme throughout the meta-narrative of God, that God has intended for his creatures to flourish. And it is his delight to work through his creatures to bring forth fruit, and the fruit glorifies him. Satan, this is the landscape that Satan wants. He wants no fruit to glorify God. He wants no creature of God to glorify him through their fruit. So, he wants to isolate you, because remember, we were talking, what is necessary for God's creatures to bring forth fruit? Relationships. And so he wants you to be isolated, because an isolated life is a fruitless life. And it could be a distorted relationship too, not a divine relationship. So Satan's ultimate scheme, and you can probably guess, Satan's ultimate scheme is to destroy relationships. Because if he can destroy relationships, he can destroy your fruitfulness. So how does he do this? Well, let's go back to the cosmic battle, because he uses lies to isolate you. He uses lies to destroy relationship. He uses lies to get your eyes off of the meta-narrative, to get your eyes off of Christ, to get your eyes off of truth. He is a liar. And he therefore gets us to embrace worldviews that are counter to the truth of God. And we lose that meta-narrative of God. One of those that has captured our culture, even though we don't think of postmodernism much, we don't use that label much, but the lies of postmodernism have permeated our culture. So let's return to our friend, Francois Lyotard, who considered to be one of the founders, and let's look at that again in light of the context of what we're talking about. So he defined postmodernism this way. He said, simplifying to the extreme, I define postmodern as incredulity toward meta-narratives. What does that mean? Again, there are only two words that we need to focus on. Incredulity. Incredulity is not a difference of opinion. Incredulity is a scoffing rejection of the notion of meta-narratives. Well, how do they define meta-narrative? A meta-narrative is any large story. Think about what this is being said here. A scoffing rejection of the notion of any large story that pretends to give an all-encompassing explanation of anything, especially an overarching story of history and life in an attempt to legitimize some version of truth. What is postmodernism attacking?
Christianity.
The meta-narrative of God, the story of God. That is exactly right, and that's why we said this is the cosmic battle. But there is a consequence here of losing the meta-narrative. What happens if you lose the larger story of God? What story are you left with?
Your own.
Your own story.
Whose story are you left with?
Our story.
What?
My story.
Our sto-
Whose?
My story?
No, not your story, my story.
No, it's not. It's my story.
Doug, it's not your, it's mine. Do you see what happens all of a sudden in a culture? And now, all of a sudden, we're not caught up in the larger story of God, we're caught up in my story. And if I'm caught up in my story, then your story could be a problem for me,
Amen.
right? So I want to talk about the consequences, and you could probably come up with 10. I want to talk about the 3 major consequences that happen to us and happen to our culture when we lose the meta-narrative, that larger story of God. And we've already talked about consequence number 1, it's all about me, and it's all about my script. Why? Because there isn't any hope about anything else, right? The only hope I have is for me. I call this the Death Star lie. It pulls us in every minute of every day. And it's all about me. It's all about my script. It's all about getting my script fulfilled. Why? Because there's a promise. This is Satan. Satan comes along and he whispers in your ear, just like he whispered to Eve. Eve, it's all about you. It's all about your script. Because there's a promise here. You will be like God. And everyone who falls into this lie, which is all of us, we fall into the lie. Why? Because we believe the promise. We believe the promise that if I can just get my will, if I can just get my script fulfilled, then I will have significance, which is probably the number one motivator of the human being. The fallen human being is motivated by significance, not the significance from God, but the significance from the world around us and things and all of it's the major driver. I will be significant if my boss would just, or I will have pleasure if my wife would just, or if my husband would just, I'd have joy, I'd have peace. If my kids would just, I would be happy. If this would happen, I would be content. This is the promise. And it's a Death Star lie. Why? Why is it a Death Star lie? What happens in reality? to your attempt to get your script fulfilled?
It doesn't.
Doesn't work.
Yeah, it doesn't.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Why? Because you are not the puppeteer. We try to be the puppeteer. We try to manipulate people around us, but it doesn't work out. It may work out for a little bit, but it doesn't work out in the end.
Amy, it is 10 after 7. Oh, come on, sweetie. I need you to rise and shine. Get up. Come on. Get up. Up and at 'em. Let's go.
Read page 2.
Sleep in until 11:30? Not gonna happen, girl. School's calling.
Next line.
Mom and Dad give me the freedom to do whatever I want all day long. Okay, let's see what mine says. I'm pretty sure it's page 3, line 6. The kids wake up on time. They get ready on their own. They grab something healthy and get out of the door by 7:30, making for another perfect morning and our perfect little house. You have 13 minutes. Get up. Andrew, up and at 'em, and with a sweet spirit.
Mom, why does your script always trump mine?
Me, Mom. You, teenager. Now get vertical and remember, sweet spirit.
We are constantly thwarted. We have this promise from the enemy that if I can get my script fulfilled, I will be happy. If I can sleep until 11:30, now it may be true. So if you could sleep in till 11:30, you may be happy. But the problem is you can't. The little boy at school may not care about you. The girl at work may not think you are handsome, whatever it is. And what happens to us, and this is why Satan is delighted with us getting caught up in our own little script, because it results in a host of negative emotions. I call them unfruitful emotions, or bad fruit emotions, or dead emotions and attitudes. And you can tell, you can tell when all of a sudden your script has been interrupted. What do you think would happen if, okay, you've got your script and you're invested in this script? Why? Because you're going to be happy and content and joyful and at peace, or you're going to be pleasured, you'll be significant, and somebody steps on your script. What kind of emotion you think would come? Anger. That's right, anger. And all of these other emotions. Next time you get angry, ask yourself if it's not because somebody just stepped on your script. Mm-hmm. And it's not just anger. You know what disappointment is? I mean, we can be pious in this stuff. I'm just really disappointed in you. And you know why? Because I wrote in my script that you would, right? That's exactly what, you know what complaining is? That's what complainers are saying, this is the way it's supposed to go. Oh, you know what? You know what worry is? Worry is an interesting one. Nobody's stepped on my script yet, but I know they're going to. That's what worry is. I'm afraid I'm not going to get my script fulfilled, and I'm worried about it. Every one of these are the result of what we're talking about right now. And this is also what quenches the Spirit of God. This is bad fruit. And Satan is delighted to get us complaining and worried. I had this great privilege to sit at lunch with Ralph McLean. He was, I think, 94 at that time. And Ralph began to tell me his story. Canadian, And as a teenager, he wanted to see the world. So he joined the Canadian Royal Rifles. And they shipped him off to Hong Kong. And he said, I was so excited to get to see Hong Kong. And on his detachment is over in Hong Kong. And a week later, the Japanese overrun. World War II begins. And Ralph McLean spends the entirety of World War II in a horrible, horrible POW camp. Many of them didn't make it. Ralph was talking to me about one of these guards that they called Satan. You've probably heard stories like this. He was so evil. He was so filled with a desire to hurt. And I'm thinking, how does one overcome something like that? Well, Ralph McLean became a Christian. And just a few years before our lunch, he said that the Japanese had invited them to come back to Japan, that they might offer their condolences and to beg for their forgiveness, to tell them they're sorry for what had happened. And Ralph said, I was so excited to go back there because I wanted to meet my captors and I wanted to look them in the eye and I wanted to tell them I forgive you. How can you do that? Well, you can do that because you're caught up in the larger story of God. And then he was telling me the story and I could see he started to cry. And he said, but in the midst of that, I looked at some of my fellow POWs and they were still filled with bitterness and anger. They could not forgive. And he said, it chokingly, he said, I realized that they were still in prison. They were still POWs after all of these years. Why? Because their script had been stomped on so hard that these people could never write their script again in that part of the script. And they couldn't forgive because of that. But Ralph was caught up in the larger story of God. And I learned later, because this story, it kind of went viral. Ralph began to go to little elementary schools because he wanted to talk to children about the story and so forth. And this was captured on video. A little girl came up to Ralph and she asked him this question. She said, Sir, would you do it all again? And he bent over to her and he said, yes, for you. And no one can do that unless you're caught up in the larger story of God. You cannot do that if it's all about your script, if it's all about your story. And this is exactly what Satan wants to snuff out. So the first consequence of losing the larger story of God is that we get caught up in our own little script and we then get subject to all of these death emotions, these unfruitful emotions. And the second one, from losing the meta-narrative, the second thing that happens is that we begin to get isolated because this begins to destroy relationships. If I live in a culture and I know that I believe that it's all about me and my script, then I know something about you. I know that you are trying to manipulate me to enhance your own story. Why? Because I'm trying to manipulate you to enhance my script. Do you see what happens to relationships? Why would you want to have a deep relationship with someone when you know all they want to do is manipulate you to enhance their own story? This isolates us. It destroys deep relationships. And this is exactly what Satan wants to have happen. Over and over again in my university students, when we talked about this thing, yeah, I get this. Why? Because they see the world, everyone is a salesman. Mm-hmm. It's sad, but that's how they see the world. Why? Because everybody's trying to manipulate everybody else to enhance their script. I was speaking of these things one time, and there was a young man. I can always tell when people want to ask questions, but they don't want to be around it, so they hang off, you know, way over there. And so he came up, and he looked at me, and he said, you know, all this thing about being caught up in your own little script. And he said, would that kind of like be when I want to get a hot girl to let me take my picture with her so I can post it on my Facebook page, that really it's not about her at all, it's all about me? And I said, yeah, that's exactly right. And he looked at me and he said, man, that's really lame, isn't it? I said, yeah, it is. And he walked away. I'm sorry I didn't get a chance to spend more time with him. But you see what happens in all of this. We have a lot of context, do we not? I mean, we live in a very connected generation. I used to tell my students this, maybe you remember this. I said, you are the most connected generation in the history of mankind. You're constantly connecting and texting. Maybe some of you are texting right now. Oh, yeah. You're the most connected generation in the history of mankind, and you are also the loneliest. And you could hear a pin drop. Why? Because that's true. And Satan is continually trying to isolate us and make us lonely so that we'll not bear fruit.
Yes, I do sometimes feel lonely.
Of course I felt lonely.
Do I ever feel lonely? Absolutely. Who doesn't, right?
I don't. I never have.
It's almost like something I don't want to admit. I definitely feel alone. At times.
I just don't get lonely. Either that or I don't know what it is.
When I feel that feeling, I would try to do something more productive instead of dwelling on it too long.
I've learned to be alone and to be okay.
Sometimes I do feel lonely, and in small doses, it can be kind of enjoyable.
The connection that we have on all these devices, it's a false intimacy. It's not real interaction. It's not real relationship.
Maybe leaving yourself in that space after you hit send, you're still left with yourself and your thoughts and your feelings, and you're busy up here, but you're not really sitting here.
I think loneliness is something that really can only be cured by relationship. Growing up in a military environment, I moved around every 2 years, and so I didn't really have friends. You kind of just grow up and you're with your nuclear family, and that's how you move around, and that's it.
It's almost like that feeling like I don't mind being alone. I don't want to feel like I'm by myself.
What would life be without other people, you know? It'd be lonely.
And this is exactly where the enemy wants us to be. This is a very fascinating statement that Jesus made. This is in the context of him telling his disciples that he was going to die. But he said this, and it's an amazing thing to me. He says, "Truly, truly, I say to you, unless a grain of wheat falls into the earth and dies, it remains by itself alone. But if it dies, it bears much fruit." And here, what we find is Jesus saying, look, the seed's end game is to fall into the earth, into a relationship that God has made for it, right? To fall into the earth and the warmth and the minerals and the sun and the water. It dies. There's a sacrifice associated with the relationships that God has made for us, but it brings forth fruit. And if you can destroy relationships, you can destroy fruit. This is the enemy's scheme. He wants to get us caught up in our own little narrative, caught up in our own little story, and isolate us, and we become fruitless. And when that happens, we end up then in a war with other people. Why? Because we're trying to manipulate them. We're trying to control the situation and control them. And you know what? It just doesn't work, and it leaves us in this pitted against each other situation. And it happens to us every day.
She's supposed to be done with that oatmeal.
Hers calls for Cocoa Puffs and ice cream.
For breakfast?
Apparently. And after eating, she slayed a trip to the zoo and then the water park and then playing with Susie. And it says in bold, no nap and no backing down.
That's interesting because mine says that she's getting a bad tooth pulled, followed by math, and then she's gonna help me clean her room. Afterwards, she'll take a long 2-hour nap and she'll awake with a sweet disposition that lingers all evening long.
Hey, sleepyhead.
Hey, can I have the car tonight?
Maybe. Where are you going?
I don't know, out.
Sarah falls in love with me when we go out tonight and park at Lookout Point.
You and Sarah, that for sure ain't gonna happen.
No, it isn't. Gotta run. Big day. They're naming the new partner at work, and I'm way overdue.
Good luck, honey.
That ain't gonna happen either, huh?
Nope. It's gonna be just like last year and the year before that. But it's fine. I'm preparing for a long night with a blue daddy.
Amy, gotta go, loser.
Well, not me. I'm the author of my fate. The world is mine. And soon Tyler will be too.
Sorry, Amy. It's gonna be another blue night for you too. But I'll cheer everyone up with my home cooking and love. And they'll feel better. And we'll be a big, happy family again. You'll see. It's what I do. I don't know what this family would do without me. Or my script.
That's our life, isn't it? Unfortunately, this is where the enemy wants us, trapped in the promise of our own little scripts, our own little stories. But is there a larger story? Is there a larger narrative? One of my favorite passages is from Isaiah 46. Remember the former things, those of long ago. I am God and there is no other. I am God and there is none like me. I make known the end from the beginning, from ancient times what is still to come. I say my purpose will stand and I will do all that I please. From the east I summon a bird of prey, from a far off land a man to fulfill my purpose. What I have said, that will I bring about. What I have planned, that will I do. There is a meta-narrative. It is his story. And did you notice something? Who is this God who summons birds? This is the God who sends. This is the God who summons people because that's how God works. He fulfills his purposes and plans through his creatures. But we might say, well, if he has a plan, is it a good one or a bad one? And I want to caution you against the expected answer, right? You know what the expected answer is. It's like, what's the expected answer in Sunday school?
Jesus.
Jesus, that's right. Jesus. It's Jesus, it's always Jesus. And for us, is God good? And we respond, yes, he's good all the time. So if you come home and find your home burned up, is that what we think? Do we think God's plans are good? So let's look at Jeremiah 29:11 for a minute. It begins, For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord. What do we learn about God right there in the beginning? What is it, Esther? What do we see?
That he has good plans for
He
us.
has plans. We don't know if they're good or not, though, right? I know the plans I have for you. Yes, by faith we know that God is good. But if God has plans for you, does this scare you?
He was writing to captives.
That's right. He was writing to captives. There was a bad situation for them. You know, Mark, if you wake up in the morning and you roll over and your wife is already looking at you and she says, boy, do I have plans for you today, that could be scary. But when God says he has plans for us, if we believe he's good, then that should be exciting to us, to know that promise and that truth, right? Look at how this continues. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you, not to harm you, plans to give you a hope and a future. Do you think God has plans to give you a hope? Of course he does. Does he have plans to give you a future? Oh man, that's our Christian hope, is it not? Does he have plans not to harm you? Not according to your script. Of course. This verse has kind of run into a buzzsaw in Christianity today, and it's because of one word in there, and you probably know what it is, and that is the word prosper. Plans to prosper you. Okay, let's stop for a second. If you're caught up in your own little story, and you read this, oh, God has plans to prosper me, and you're caught up in your own little story, what do you think that means?
Nice home, nice car.
Yeah, that's right. Have you seen the new Dodge Charger? Yeah, that's in my script. What else?
Nice job.
Nice job.
I get what I want.
I get what I want. So it'd be important for us to think about what would this mean if I'm caught up in the larger story of God? What does it mean when he says, I have plans to prosper you? Maybe we ought to look at the word. Do you know a Hebrew word? You don't know a Hebrew? You know Hebrew words. Give me a Hebrew word here.
Shalom.
Shalom, yes, shalom, which means
Peace.
peace, yes. Unfortunately, we've truncated that to mean peace, which to some extent we end up turning into all about my script again, right? We want peace, which basically means I get everything I want, and then I'm at peace. But the word shalom is larger than that, because the word shalom means may you be everything that God has made you to be. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to shalom you. That is the Hebrew word, shalom. It's an amazing word because it goes along with everything that we've been talking about. This is what God wants in his creatures. That they would be everything that he has made you to be. If he's made you to be a peach tree, may you have the most delicious peaches. May your limbs be filled with fruit. If he's made you to be a blueberry bush, may you be filled with the most luscious blueberries. Not may you get everything that your script calls for. These are the consequences. Number one, it's all about me and my script. Number two, isolation and loss of relationships. And this third one is critical. A need for you to listen carefully to what is going on here. Because the enemy is trying to counter God. Now remember that God has a delight to equip us, to empower us, to send us, so that he might work through his creatures with their abilities. He gives them responsibility, authority, and power to shalom. And he distributes his power and authority to the lowest level so that the smallest creature might flourish. Even the chestnut-backed chickadee found in the northern parts of the U.S. The smallest creature might flourish. Now let's contrast that to what the enemy wants to do. What the enemy wants to do is to consolidate power and authority, enslaving God's creatures, making them dependent, destroying their incentive to be fruitful to shalom. We're going to do this again because it's critical for us. I don't want you to miss this. God distributes his power so that the smallest creature might flourish. The enemy consolidates power and makes dependence. And when he does that, he destroys their incentive. He destroys their desire. You can talk about the loss of self-esteem in the right way, in understanding who you are before God. There's no purpose and meaning, and you become barren. Why? Because you become dependent. That's why in Colorado, we have a rule for bears. And you're not allowed to feed the bears. Why? Because the bears become dependent upon you. But we care more for bears than we do for people. This is Satan's work. And if you happen to be thinking at this moment in terms of some of the institutions that we have, then you would be thinking correctly. Look at the history of nation states. It's the same thing that happens over and over again. When power is consolidated at the top, the people become fruitless, and it eventually will collapse. The same happened in the church. Remember, there was a time in the church when all spiritual power was consolidated at the top. You weren't even allowed to read the scriptures on your own. And I think we've reverted back to that. You know the passage, you know this passage in Ephesians chapter 4. The design for the church, the pastors and the evangelists, all the leaders, what is their job? This will sound familiar to you. Their job is to do what?
Equip the saints.
To equip, does that sound familiar? To equip the saints
For the
and
work,
the saints
the work of the
for
ministry.
the work of ministry. See, we find ourselves today, that's all backwards. We now think the saint's job is to equip the cleric, and the cleric does the work of ministry. That's backwards. And what happens then is that the mass of people become fruitless. You know, we show up on Sunday and get sprinkled and put money in the coffer so that they can, I'm not demeaning the cleric. You understand that? One of these things, what happens is we have a tendency to, in a fallen world, to say, just let them do it, right? Write a check. That's not how God intended it. That's not the design. But this is what Satan wants to do. Satan will constantly be pulling power up to the top, away from the people, and make them dependent so that they lose their desire to be fruitful. So I want to pull us into a little personal application here for a second. I want you to consider watching the gauges in your own life. When I first went into the Air Force to fly, they run pilots in pilot training through simulators first. I guess that's to save, well, they say it's to save lives, but it saves money, actually, what it does. And you go into a simulator, and the crew that is going to run your flight that day, they're not there to let you have a really nice flight. You know, they're there to see if you can recognize when the is not the ought. And so I took off, and man, I think, man, I'm a good stick. This thing is flying. I have control of this. And then all of a sudden, things started to go bad. And everything I tried, all the stuff didn't work. And the next thing I know, the NCO keyed the my headset, and he said, "Sir, you're dead." And I don't know what caused me to ask him. I said, "Well, is that fully dead or partially dead?" And he said, "Sir, you are a smoking hole in the ground." And we went back through the post brief and I found I missed a gauge. If I'd seen that gauge early on, I could have made that correction. So sometimes we need to check our gauges. Do we find ourselves angry, frustrated? Are we worried? If we are, it's because we've bought this lie. Somewhere we bought this lie. Am I a complainer? Is there bitterness somewhere? Am I a controlling person? Trying to control all the events around me. I get focused on my own little script. All of this will keep us from fulfilling the royal law. And you know, this is where Satan wants us. He's okay if you are concerned primarily about just polishing the lamp. And I'm going to go further here. I'm going to step out here for a second. I'm going to submit to you that Satan is fine if you go to church every Sunday. I think he's fine if you go to church Sunday morning, Sunday evening, and even the prayer service on Wednesday night. I'm not demeaning that. I think he's fine if you read your Bible in the morning and you read it at night. I think he's fine if you pray 5 times a day, 10 times a day, as long as you're not bearing fruit. Because as long as you're just a pretty lamp, as long as you're just a pretty green fig tree, then there's nothing but downstream death behind you. And you will eventually die out, wear out, and the flow goes on without that life that God had intended for you and me to bring. I'm not talking about in entirety. I'm talking about those moments when we find ourselves caught up in our own little script. To be bearing fruit that might bring life downstream.